60 degrees below zero, has a way of stripping a human soul down to its absolute barest components. Out here, deep in the frozen expanse of the Siberian taiga, the cold is not merely a weather condition. It is a living, breathing entity. It gnaws at the reinforced logs of the cabin, screams through the tops of the black pines, and waits with infinite patience for you to make a single, fatal mistake. Martha Higgins knew this better than anyone. At 72 years old, her face was a topographic map of hard years and harder choices, lined with deep creases that spoke of decades spent outrunning her past. She sat in her heavy rocking chair beside the cast-iron stove, her gnarled, arthritic hands feeding birch logs into the roaring belly of the fire. The cabin was a fortress of solitude, built by her late husband, Arthur, 40 miles away from the nearest settlement of Oymyakon. They had come to the end of the earth 25 years ago, fleeing a life in Chicago that had grown far too dangerous. Arthur had been an accountant for a man named Thomas Sterling, a man who did not forgive stolen ledgers. Arthur had died of a stroke a decade ago, leaving Martha to tend the fire and wait for the ghosts of their past to either find her or forget her entirely. Tonight, the blizzard outside was biblical. The wind hurled a barrage of ice against the thick window panes, a deafening roar that swallowed the silence of the cabin. Martha wrapped a thick wool shawl tighter around her frail shoulders, taking a sip of bitter black tea. Then came the sound. It was faint at first, easily mistaken for a heavy branch snapping under the weight of the snow. But then it came again, a dull, rhythmic thudding against the heavy oak of her front door. Martha froze. Her pale blue eyes darted to the heavy iron deadbolt. Nobody traversed the taiga in a whiteout. A person would be blind, disoriented, and frozen solid within 20 minutes. To be out in this storm was suicide. Yet, the thudding persisted. Weaker this time. It was the desperate, failing strike of a dying human being. She set her mug down on the wooden table, her joints popping in protest as she stood. From the mantel above the fireplace, she retrieved Arthur's old hunting rifle, checking the chamber with practiced, mechanical efficiency. She approached the door, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Who is it?" she shouted, though she knew her voice could never pierce the howling wind outside. She unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy door inward. The storm immediately invaded the cabin, a violent rush of sub-zero air that stole the breath from her lungs. A figure collapsed across the threshold, a mountain of snow-caked furs and synthetic fabric tumbling face-first onto her braided rug. Martha pushed the door shut, throwing her entire meager weight against the wind to force the oak back into its frame. The latch clicked, and the sudden quiet in the room was deafening. At her feet lay a man. He was large, broad-shouldered, but currently curled into a tight, shivering fetal position. Frost coated his eyelashes, and his lips were an alarming shade of cobalt blue. "Help," he croaked, the word barely a rasp of air. Survival instincts overrode her innate paranoia. Martha knelt, her old bones aching, and grabbed the man by the collar of his heavy parka, dragging him closer to the radiant heat of the cast-iron stove. She worked quickly, her hands surprisingly deft as she stripped away his ice-armored outer layers. Underneath the parka, he wore a thick wool sweater and heavy insulated pants. She fetched tepid water in a basin, knowing that hot water on frozen skin would cause shock and tissue damage, and began to gently wipe his face. As the frost melted, a face emerged. He was a younger man, perhaps in his early 40s, with a strong jawline and a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. "My name is James," he stammered, his teeth chattering violently. "James Cole." "Don't speak," Martha commanded, her voice raspy but firm. "Save your energy for shivering. It means your body is still fighting." She draped heavy wool blankets over him and poured a cup of warm, diluted broth from a pot on the stove, carefully lifting his head so he could drink. He swallowed greedily, coughing as the warmth hit his frozen throat. Over the next 2 hours, the color slowly returned to James's cheeks. The violent shivering subsided into a mild tremor. He sat up, leaning heavily against the log wall near the stove, clutching the blanket around his shoulders. "I owe you my life," James said, his voice finding its resonance. It was a smooth, cultured voice, out of place in the rugged wilderness. My snowmobile hit a hidden ravine about 5 miles south of here. The track snapped. I thought I was dead. I saw the smoke from your chimney. Martha sat across from him, the hunting rifle resting casually across her lap. She kept her expression completely unreadable. 5 miles in a whiteout at 60 below, she mused softly. You must have a guardian angel, James. Most men wouldn't make it 500 yards. I was desperate, he replied, offering a weak, charming smile. I'm a geologist, working for a mining survey out of Yakutsk. I got separated from my team before the storm hit. Martha nodded slowly, her pale eyes locking onto his. A geologist. Fascinating work, I imagine. It pays the bills, James said, shifting his weight. He glanced around the cabin, his eyes lingering on the sparse furnishings, the shelves of canned goods, and finally, the heavy wooden floorboards. You live out here all alone? This is incredibly remote. My husband and I built this place, Martha said. He passed on. I prefer the quiet. Still, James pressed gently. A woman your age. It must be difficult. What happens if you get sick? Or injured? I don't, she replied flatly. As the hours ticked by and the storm raged on, Martha's mind raced. Something was fundamentally wrong. It wasn't just the sheer statistical impossibility of surviving a 5-mile trek in this weather. It was the physical evidence. When she had removed his boots, she noted they were military-grade tactical winter boots, not the heavy, insulated pack boots a geologist would wear on a survey. His hands, now warmed, were completely devoid of calluses. They were the smooth, manicured hands of a city man, not someone who spent his days pulling core samples out of frozen earth. And then there was the way he sat. Despite his near-death experience, his eyes were sharp, calculating, constantly scanning the room. He didn't have the shell-shocked aura of a man who had just narrowly escaped the void. He had the focused intensity of a predator in a cage. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when James asked to use the outhouse attached to the rear of the cabin. As he walked away, leaning heavily on the wall for support, Martha quickly checked the pockets of the heavy parka she had hung by the door. Her fingers brushed against cold metal. She pulled back the fabric to reveal a silenced 9mm pistol in an intricate shoulder holster. Geologists did not carry suppressed handguns. Deeper in the inner pocket, she found a small, waterproof leather slip. Inside was a photograph, worn at the edges. Martha felt the blood drain from her face, a cold far worse than the Siberian winter gripping her heart. The photograph was of her. It was a surveillance shot, taken decades ago in Chicago, showing her and Arthur walking out of a bank. Scrawled on the back in black ink was a single word: find. Martha slipped the photo back into the coat precisely as she had found it. She walked back to her rocking chair, picked up the rifle, and waited. James returned a few minutes later, looking much stronger. He sat back down by the stove, rubbing his hands together. This fire is incredible. You have a beautiful home, Mrs. Higgins. Martha lied smoothly, using the alias she had adopted upon arriving in Russia. James smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Higgins. Right. You know, sitting here, I can't help but feel a strange sense of fate. Out of all the millions of acres of frozen wasteland, my snowmobile breaks down right near the cabin of an American. We are all drawn to where we are meant to be, Martha said, her thumb resting lightly on the safety of the rifle. James leaned forward, the facade of the helpless geologist beginning to crack, revealing the cold, hardened enforcer beneath. You see, Martha, if I may call you Martha, I don't believe in fate. I believe in perseverance. I believe in hunting down what belongs to my employer. Martha didn't flinch. She kept her rocking chair moving in a slow, rhythmic sway. And who is your employer, James? A man who has a very long memory, James said softly. Thomas Sterling sends his regards. He also wants the $3 million Arthur wired out of his accounts in 1998. The name hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The ghost had finally arrived. Arthur is dead, Martha stated, her voice devoid of emotion. I know, James replied, casually reaching into his sweater, undoubtedly feeling for the holster that was no longer there. His eyes widened slightly as he realized he had been stripped of his weapon when Martha removed his coat. A cruel, twisted smile touched Martha's lips. Looking for something? James's demeanor shifted instantly. The charming facade vanished, replaced by pure malice. You're a smart old bird. I'll give you that. I knew I couldn't just kick the door in. I was actually freezing to death out there. But the tracker on my sled led me right to your coordinates. Now, you can shoot me with that antique rifle. But Thomas knows where you are. There will be others. Tell me where the money is, and I promise you a quick, painless death. Refuse, and I will make this harsh winter seem like a summer breeze. Martha stopped rocking. The silence in the cabin was palpable, save for the crackling of the birch logs. You made 3 fatal errors, James, Martha said, her voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. First, you assumed I am the same frightened woman who ran from Chicago 25 years ago. Second, you assumed Arthur hid the money here in this cabin. James narrowed his eyes, his muscles tensing, preparing to lunge across the small distance separating them. And the third, you assumed the tea I gave you was just for warmth. James paused. A flicker of confusion passed over his face, rapidly followed by a sudden, terrifying realization. He looked down at his hands. They were trembling, but not from the cold. A deep, heavy lethargy was suddenly crashing over him. A wave of leaden exhaustion that pulled at his eyelids and turned his blood to syrup. What did you do? He slurred, trying to push himself up from the floor. His legs refused to cooperate, buckling beneath him like wet paper. Siberia is a harsh teacher, Martha explained calmly, standing up from her chair. You learn what plants can heal and what plants can protect. The roots of the aconitum flower wolfsbane grow wild by the river in the summer. I harvest them. I dry them. In a large dose, it stops the heart. In the microdose, I slipped into your broth. It acts as a severe paralytic. It takes about an hour to fully metabolize in a warm body. James let out a guttural roar, using his arms to drag his heavy body across the wooden floorboards toward her. I'll kill you, you old witch, he spat, his speech heavily slurred, his face contorting in rage and panic. Martha simply stepped aside. James collapsed onto the braided rug, his face planting into the woven fabric. He tried to push himself up, but his arms gave out completely. He lay there, paralyzed from the neck down, his eyes wide with a terror he had likely only ever inflicted upon others. Arthur didn't steal the money for us, Martha said, kneeling beside his immobilized form. He stole it to donate to the families of the people Thomas Sterling ruined. The money was gone the week we left America. There is no treasure here, James. Only ice. Please, James gasped, his chest barely rising and falling as the paralytic took hold of his diaphragm. The ruthless assassin was gone, replaced by a terrified, helpless boy staring into the abyss. Please, don't. Martha stood back up, looking down at the man who had crossed the world to murder her. She walked over to the heavy oak door and unlocked the deadbolt. She pulled it open, allowing the violent, screaming blizzard to rush back into the cabin. The temperature in the room immediately plummeted. She walked over to James, grabbed him by the collar of his sweater with a strength born of pure survival, and dragged his paralyzed body toward the open door. 60 degrees below zero, Martha whispered into his ear as she positioned him on the threshold. It has a way of silencing everything. With a final, hard shove, she rolled him out onto the snow-covered porch. She didn't wait to hear his final, gasping plea. She slammed the heavy oak door shut, throwing the deadbolt and locking out the storm. And the past. Once and for all. Martha Higgins walked back to her rocking chair. She picked up another birch log, tossed it into the roaring cast-iron stove, and poured herself a fresh cup of tea. The winter was harsh, but she was harsher.